and start using that stuff. And so there's a traditional idea of a lot of science fiction stories, again, notably Star Trek, but also Star Wars, is that you've got people on a ship or a space colony who are going out into space, which is the kind of the final frontier, to quote directly from Star Trek. And Earth is the center of civilization, at least in Star Trek. It's where it's the capital of the universe, and the frontier is the planets. And so, in this case, I was trying to flip that around and say the more plausible way that this would develop would be that we would use in situ materials, so asteroids, pieces of the moon, to build environments to our specifications. And those environments would be very settled, organized places. They would be like living in Singapore. And the Earth below in this version becomes kind of the wild, crazy frontier that has to be explored and settled. So that was kind of the general set of goals I was trying to pursue with the 70s project. And I have no real conclusion to come to, but I thought it might make for a good conversation starter in this context.
Great. So we're going to ask a few questions up here. Ariel and I will ping pong a little bit, then we'll open it up because I'm sure there are a ton of questions you guys have waiting. We talked a bit, actually, when we chatted this morning about, some people are hired to look out 100 years. Some of the programs you've been involved in. That's a very hard thing for anybody to do now in many ways. And in 7 Eves, you look up, 10,000 or more years, of course, but you basically shortcut a bunch of things that are kind of on every science fiction author's plate right now. So this whole AI singularity thing, we all have our opinions about that, but that happens on a time scale of maybe 20, 30, 40 years, before a century is up.
Yeah.
So you basically sidestep that because they can't make computer ICs of the kind we can now in orbit for some reason in your novel. So they can't get there, and we didn't get there beforehand.
Didn't want to go there.
Yeah, because that would definitely tweak it in crazy ways.
Yeah.
Although biology, you got to the point where we're able to play with our genome. So we were far enough along. Without that, of course, they wouldn't have made it.
Right.
You got far enough along for that. And of course, that leads to the whole future of what race would be, right? DNA is just a CD's worth of editable data.
Leads to the ring.
You can make it more or less what you want in this kind of a world that's coming. Yeah. You kind of brought it back in that there are the Eves, and everything comes from the Eves, and they have their own identity. So you kind of reinvented it. But one wonders if that is just something that is an anachronism, not something that's part of the future.
Well, it's I think part of what the book is trying to do is to sort of interrogate the idea of race a little bit, and what we mean by that. So I'm trying to do that in what I hope is an accessible way. There's that, and then, I just didn't want to go into the whole AI singularity thing for that book. Because I already felt like there was enough going on. And so I made that into a cultural decision on the part of the people. These people have to rebuild a civilization out of rocks. And they have records of the civilization that came before, which to them are sort of like their Homeric epic and their Bible and their Federalist Papers. And they're always looking at those, and certain people and certain habits have become kind of proverbial to them as the result of that. And one thing they've decided they don't like very much is anything that's too cyber, or too sort of social media-ish. There's some villains in the piece in the early days, who have been led astray by that, and so they make a cultural decision kind of not to go there, and that's probably me just being cowardly and not wanting to mix that in with a bunch of other stuff.
I think in some way, though, we can appreciate that because I understand maybe not wanting to take on the AI and the singularity topic. We have enough dystopian fiction about where that's going. And I think the Media Lab's now trying to put a different narrative on that, something more positive around ethics. But you did really treat social media and in some ways presaged what can happen with tribalism and the splitting up of communities on social media. And this was in 2014, 2015, well before 2016, 2017, and now, which is interesting that those social conversations are now still very trenchant.
Yeah, come to think about it, I think of myself as having totally missed that and being totally surprised by the elections and all that, because I was totally surprised. But yeah, it's talked about some in Seven Eves.
Yeah.
So many words.
Not to look at.
Twitter is an amazing barrage sometimes.
Yeah.
Hence social
You can
media.
ignore that.
Yeah.
A question for you about technology and what we should be working on here at the lab. So the Space Exploration Initiative has a goal of trying to actively prototype our sci-fi future. So in many ways we are inspired, and as I mentioned to you before, my PhD research is in some ways inspired by the robots in Seven Eves. Of the technical concepts that you've dreamed up, what would you want us to build that has yet to be built? And maybe start with Seven Eves, since we're on the space topic, but if there's something from Diamond Age that you still really want, what would you ask the Space Initiative or the Media Lab to build?
In that, I have to say that the one, and this probably isn't the answer you're looking for, but the one thing that is totally dominates my attention right now is the whole problem of how do you have a civil society if you can't agree on what factual reality is. So, and that's not unfortunately not a hardware solvable problem that I'm aware of. It's this thing happened that came out of, I think, an idealistic view of what the internet was going to be, and it was, the internet sort of was that for a brief time, and now that seems sort of quaint and naive. So now I'm mostly interested in trying to figure out ways that we could restructure the social media universe in such a way as to encourage a more civic-minded kind of approach to life, because that stuff is now completely owned and penetrated to the core by bad actors. And I don't know how to fix that.
I mean, going even further, right, with the work you're doing at Magic Leap together with, your Prescience and Snow Crash, there'll be a point where we can physically perceive a different reality from somebody else. If our senses are mediated by ubiquitous AR, then it's not something at arm's length, which has caused tremendous damage. Now it's physically what in real time we see and hear. Could this be better somehow instead of worse?
Well, I mean, I would say the point of working with any kind of media, be it AR or VR or conventional media, is to give the user something that in some way is more rewarding or more interesting than the practical reality that's out there. And so I think, this is a very old distinction that goes back to Aristotle. So history versus poetry, and media gives us a way to create not just history, but to create poetry, to create things that partake of the imaginary, of art. So I'm sure we'll also have very practical-minded applications. But I think the ones that people are going to get excited about are the ones that have a more, they're sort of poetic in the sense Aristotle meant. Not strictly realistic, based on some element of fancy or imagination.
Do you think Nell's primer from Diamond Age was something along those lines? And is there a concept, and like a parallel concept now for us, what a primer would be?
So the interesting thing about that is how many different people have have decided that they want to implement some version or some aspect of it. And I long ago kind of lost track.
You'd mentioned that there's been some work at the Media Lab.
There have
right?
been a dozen theses that have a primer in them.
Yeah. So and so I think the important thing is to not to privilege any one of those over any other. It's that person's getting it right. Because what's interesting is the different takes different people have on it. Some people come at it from a hardware point of view. How could we build something that worked like that? Some people come at it from a performance art point of view, or a software point of view. I haven't thought about it in the context of the other issue I mentioned of, can we agree on what's factual? But maybe we need one of those.
I think is certainly truth is also education. They're both related, right? Now we think education is the path to truth. But I think the question coming up now is, what do we learn in our brain, and what does the cloud learn, and how do they come together? Because our brains are rapidly being outsourced. I search now. I'll remember just a few words, and I'll take out my phone, Google it, and that's what it is. So I don't have to remember things the way I used to, and I can also remember more, maybe. And when we have the wearable, that's going to be omnipresent and alert. It'll be part of our brain. And where we stop, where the cloud begins, is just an intriguing thing. And that makes me think of Strauss's novel Accelerando, where the guy has the glasses, he takes them off, and he's stupid, right? He is mentally deficient. He cannot function. And are we trending toward a society like that? Is there a way to do it to make it work for the better, and you can still live without them?
Yeah, the theory that every enhancement is an amputation. I can't remember who came up with that phrase, but it stuck with me. No, I mean, we use technology in all kinds of ways to get better at things. I have clothes, so I can go out into the cold Cambridge, Massachusetts winter and not be cold. That doesn't mean that I don't look down on myself for being a weak person who would get cold outside if I went out there without clothes on. It's just we look for ways to use tech to make things better, and at a certain point we stop referring to them as technology. I think people have expressed this in various ways, but the one that has stuck with me is technology is anything that was invented after you were born, right? So again, I don't know who said that. We should Google it. Buttons, tires, scissors, those are all technologies, and we're going to keep on making technologies.
Have you seen the hyper-reality video by Kiichi Matsuda? It's been circulating around the lab. It's a dystopian 5-minute view on everywhere AR.
Oh, yeah.
And it's set in
Medellin.
Yeah. But the most amazing part of that movie, for that short for me, is when she gets hacked and you see the real world, and it's dull. Even though you've been totally shocked by all this overload, when it goes away, it's just like you have the soul sucked out of you for a few minutes. You want it back. Will we be addicted to this? Is addiction even the right word?
I think, anything, if it's used in an abusive way, can be abusive. So it's not the purpose of that video is to very carefully and consciously depict the most annoying possible sort of bad use of immersive technology, and that person does an excellent job of it. And what anyone comes away with who sees the video is that it's we don't want that, So if we, it's what I see in like today's internet is that there's this constant push-pull between people, advertisers mostly, who are trying to exploit the existing channels to put as many ads in your face and as many interruptions as they can pack in, and things like ad blockers and so on, and filters that are keeping that stuff at bay.
Yeah. It's interesting to consider as well. There's this kind of black mirror side of AR and responsive environment tech and being completely immersed in these things, and yet we do see some models where maybe they are more purely altruistic or beneficial things for humans. And something that comes to mind is pilots. The more they come to rely on autopilot, there's always concern that the better the autopilot gets, that's great, but then the pilots will lose some of their proficiency and not be able to actually jump in and save it. And yet there's a way to balance that. There's a way to keep the pilots engaged. In a space context, NASA is already looking at ways for astronauts to use VR to be connected to Houston, right? So they can have a VR headset, be trying to fix something mission critical on the International Space Station, and be getting a live person from Houston, not just giving them a checklist where you have a whole list of human factors issues that might confuse what you do, but an actual guided tour with this assistive VR technology. Things like that, rather than thinking of it solely as an appendage that's been cut off. Is there enough assistive tech like that you're excited about?
I mean, I think a lot of what we see right now in the way the internet works today grows out of the fact that everyone opted for a free model,
Right.
and so. The only way for people to make money is with advertising and other gimmicks like that. I think if we get away from that, and it's related to what I was talking about earlier in the way that social media, have been penetrated by bad actors. If you can get a free account and you can make a bot that'll sign up for a bazillion free accounts anytime you want, then it leads to a particular kind of usage or abuse of the system that makes it a lot less satisfying for a lot of the users.
I've often wondered about the solution to that, if we wanted to dig on that in particular. I personally would be more than happy to pay for the services that I'm getting for free. If instead of having to pay in my privacy and my data, I was able to just pay Gmail as a service, I certainly would. Mm-hmm. But then does that set up a bit of a have and a have-nots scenario where the relatively privileged among us can pay for the services and not be exploited by our data, and then the remainder are still being exploited in some way with this free data? Or is there a better economic answer that we really could go to a not freemium model where it's so easily exploited across the board?
Yeah, I don't know. Jaron Lanier has had some really interesting thoughts on that topic in his last couple of books, so you should get him up here.
I know Patty's had him many times from
old friend
of Patty. Yeah. So.
Yeah, here you tend to see a lot more support for a free and open internet. And people, of course, equate innovation at that level, right, where there's nobody charging more for certain packets, and it's all free, so you can try whatever you want. On the other hand, you have the dark side, so it's always a balance.
Yeah.
In Seven Eves, you created a very rich world with, and a lot of it you only see at the end. Right? These other cultures that I kind of suspected were always there. I was reading the book. Yeah, they are there.
In the
and
oceans.
That's who they are.
Yeah.
And okay, then the book ends. So you're not one for sequels usually, but would we be seeing maybe a sequel to this or a development on this? And if so, my question would be, do we find out more about the agent?
Well, the overall idea was to build a science fictional universe and see what happened. And what may happen, what I'm optimistic will happen, is that we may be able to start realizing that universe in media. So we've got some conversations going on with Skydance and with Imagine about bringing 70s to the screen. And nothing's definite until it's definite, but We've got an exciting group of people behind that project now, and I'm hoping it'll move forward and that we'll be able to answer a lot of those questions. Maybe not in a novelistic sequel, but but in media.
So should we open it up? This might be a good time. I'm sure you're all waiting for questions. Laura has the tossable microphone. I don't know if that was a Media Lab invention. I first saw it here with Ted Selker years ago. So, any questions from the floor? I'm sure. Okay, over here. Can you catch? Oops.
Asked how can we, I'm not sure exactly how you phrased it, but how can we coordinate our actions and do things effectively if we don't agree on facts?
Hold the cube closer to your...
It keeps going up and down.
Yeah.
And I think you answered that question in Anthem, where you had the people from the outside and the people from the inside collaborating together because they had a shared goal or a shared, a mutual emotional connection. So even if they didn't necessarily have the same backgrounds and agree on the facts in the past, they had a motivation to solve the problems using current facts and things. So I think you answered your own question with that book. I love that book, by the way. It's a great book.
Yeah, thank you. So asked and answered, but it's a reference to Anthem, which is a book where a universe where you've got sort of all of the blue state book reading people, have been herded into monastic compounds, and they hang out together and be nerds, and they're sort of surrounded by a bigger civilization that mostly doesn't care about them. And yeah, the book gets into how can those two groups work together.
So over here, if you can toss it.
So I guess my question would kind of flip the Media Lab perspective on its head a little, because, as a novelist, the technology is it's at least as I read your stuff, is a probe for what novelists do, which is try and understand human beings, the characters you create, and sort of some problems in human nature. So I guess what I'm curious is you've said several problems that we need to address in technical, in the technical area, what we might do about fact, what we might do about AI, the various technologies that make a lot of your work so exciting. But what I'd love to know is what human problem you're trying to investigate. If there's a program through your work, or if there's specific novels where you try to get at certain aspects of human nature and human emotion and that kind of thing.
I'm having a little bit of trouble with the monitor, so I'm not catching 100% of the questions that are being asked on this thing.
Is that any better?
That's it.
There you go. Got to hold it like this, So yeah, I'm just saying that sort of flip the. I'm wondering about your own process, I guess. I mean, the technology and the questioning about where we're going with different machines and our affordances makes a lot of your work, incredibly exciting. But at the same time, sort of the novelist's job is often to probe the human emotion, the human concerns, qualities of human nature.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what aspects of, what if you have a program through many of your books, or if you're thinking about something now, what is it about the way human beings are interacting that's really making you curious?
Well, I think the novel is a pop culture medium, and I'm an entertainer, and so I think I fear the moment when I lose sight of those two facts, and try to be something else. So the novel's always been straight up pop culture. Its purpose is to entertain people by telling yarns, and my job is to do that. So I think the first goal is always to hit that objective and to tell a story that people want to keep reading, and that can mean a lot of different things. But one of the things that you do need to do is to engage people on topics and themes that are emotionally important to them. I mean, it's partly style and storytelling and pacing and plot, but the subject matter needs to be something that is of interest and that feels relevant to people. You know, and a thing that I've been around a lot is technology, and so that tends to be my hook, right? And so to the extent that people are interested in space, for example, well, okay, I can write a yarn about space that, you know, it'll have explosions and fights and, you know, drama and all the stuff that makes for a good story, but it's set in a kind of technological world, and I can talk about delta V and, you know, hypergolic propellants and all of that stuff, you know, as part of the fabric of the story. So I think, you know, in the best case, out of all of that comes something that has these sort of more sophisticated payloads. But my approach is not to come at it on that level. There's always got to be an underlying yarn and some characters. And if I really work hard and do my job right, you know, I may get to some of the more elevated goals at the end.
To jump in there with one thought, I'd say, at least from my perspective, I think you have achieved a really interesting human story or character development, especially for young women.
Oh, thanks.
As someone reading Nell's story, and Nell in the primary, was fantastic to see her character development. And Seven Eves, it's about the women who found the future of humanity and figured it out amongst themselves. And it's not to say that that's not present elsewhere in science fiction, but it is rare. Women tend to have a very different, sometimes frankly, sex bot role in a lot of other science fiction from the 50s forward. And your stories are so different, and I really appreciate that from a human character development story.
Well, thanks. Thank you very much for the vote of confidence. It means a lot.
Charles.
I love the vision of the internet, the metaverse vision, where it's more experiential and less about facts, true or not. What's holding us back from having that in real life?
From having the metaverse version of things. I mean, it went in a totally different direction, right? So I actually wrote Snow Crash before we had the internet per se. I mean, the internet existed, obviously, but it wasn't. Most people who were online were not on the internet. They were on like CompuServe or proprietary services.
CERN.
What?
CERN.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in some ways, it's a dated picture. It's more based on television. Like, okay, we've got these for-profit online services. What if they were in 3D? You know, and what if the people who ran those services were trying to provide a kind of bread and circus model that would attract a lot of viewers, a lot of users, and so. You know, the metaverse is founded on a certain kind of scarcity model that you've got the street, which is the high-value real estate, and everybody wants to be on the street. There's only so much real estate there, and that's not what happened, right? So what happened was that we got the web, which is, I mean, there's high-value domains on the web, but it's mostly a kind of free, like one URL is the same as any other URL. And so you don't have that scarcity model in the same way. So I sort of feel like I was wrong with the metaverse. if you really want to dig down, it comes to the fact that what made 3D graphics cheap wasn't television, it was video games. And so to have a metaverse, to have any kind of 3D shared reality, the first thing you've got to have is cheap 3D graphics. And the way we ended up getting cheap 3D graphics was people wanting to play video games, and that driving the cost of cards, of graphics cards, down to almost nothing. So what we've got is more of a game-based economy than a TV-based.
I'm not sure I totally understand. So, but could we get there?
To the metaverse, to that style of, I mean, anyone could set it up, right? But you've got to attract people to it. So I don't know. Stay tuned, I guess.
Can we get Neha over here? Good throw. That's a good throw.
Hi. I loved Cryptonomicon and the way that you talked about cryptography and code breaking and how you explained it to people. And I wanted to ask you about cryptocurrencies. So I work on cryptocurrencies, and you write a lot about money and sort of the way people pay for things in your future. And I'm curious to hear about what you think is going on now. And even in Reamed, you wrote about sort of the mining that was happening in games. And so what are your thoughts on virtual currencies and the future of money?
Well, you know, I'm kind of like a lot of people vaguely aware that there's a whole lot of ferment going on in that area with with ICOs of various kinds, you know, and that there's a range of those from, you know, very sketchy or like maybe not even serious at all, but more like parodies of ICOs to ones that seem to have more legitimacy. You know, I don't, like, I look on in amazement, but I don't feel myself to be that in touch, you know, with that stuff anymore. There was this moment, like Cryptonomicon came out of this moment in the 90s when a lot of the Bay Area cypherpunks broke towards money. You know, they were working on all kinds of applications of crypto at the time, and figured out that you could do financial transactions, and they got really interested in money, so that's kind of where that came from. The current happenings, I don't feel like I have as much of a connection to the story of those people. I kind of knew the story of the Bay Area cypherpunks, and I think that gave me a novelistic kind of soil for something to grow out of. I'm not in touch in the same way with people who are doing the ICO stuff right now. And that leaves me kind of a little bit with my nose pressed up against the glass.
Do you want to know more about it?
Talk to Neha.
Well, no, I mean, I know who to call. You know, and now you're on that list too. But I just haven't decided to dive back into it, I guess.
One thing, I just wanted to distinguish between the cryptocurrencies and the ICOs.
Oh.
I think a lot of the ICOs are scams. It's people kind of trying to take advantage of others and sell things that don't really have a lot of basis to them. But I do think there's something behind the idea of cryptocurrencies. I think they're really interesting. So,
yeah, thanks for clarifying the distinction, and I agree with you. You know, I heard one thing and substituted another, so my bad.
Shin.
Okay. I actually could not ask for a better leading question after this one.
You may want to hold that up closer so we can hear
Okay.
you.
So great question to follow up on, actually. So I found like this technology discussion really fascinating, but so far all the kind of conversations I've heard are still quite much operating under a capitalistic institution. So whatever the technology we're developing, we're still under assumption it's going to be economically benefiting the rich or kind of separate, or draw more separations in the society. So for me, I kind of curious, is there any technology so far you can see happening or you're imagining that would actually change the political and social structure? There's a very stupid, simple example I'm throwing out there, it might be not accurate at all, is if brain interfaces could achieve to a certain level that people reach collective intelligence, would it change the way human relationship and then the way we connect with each other and the buying and selling you and me? If that concept is challenged, I think it's interesting to look at whether the capitalistic structure is still going to be stable as now.
So could some of the work that's going on here in the way
or
of,
anywhere you saw
Yeah, but-
before or you're in your imagination.
yeah, some of the kind of work that's going on here, could it create alterations in the way economic systems work that take us away from a capitalistic model and toward a socialistic?
Not necessarily socialistic, but something else.
Something else. Yeah, big question, and probably a novel-worthy undertaking to answer that one. It has been. It's been notable to me that the legs have been kicked out from under the left, the economic left. Like it's kind of happened slowly over a period of decades, but right now, people who are not fans of straight up capitalism don't have a lot of arrows in their quiver. Don't have a lot of levers to affect the kinds of changes they want to see, which is very different from the way it was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, where there was more of a balance between labor and capital, I would say, and it wasn't pretty, but there was, there were kind of there was a functioning kind of labor movement that was able to wield some real power. It's really swung the other way, and I understand why. But it's definitely interesting to speculate on what, if anything, could replace that.
Hi. Oops, sorry. We have a question from Greg Tucker, who's a former MIT labber. He is watching, and he wants to know what your goal was for System of the World and its 2 companion books.
You have to speak up, actually.
Oh, sorry. The question is, what was Neal's goal in System of the World and its 2 companion books?
System of the World and what?
The 2 companion books.
The 2 companion books.
Companion books. Oh, got it. So yeah, the Baroque cycle grew up. Thank you. Grew out of. It was an unexpected offshoot of Cryptonomicon. As I was finishing Cryptonomicon, within space of about a week, I received 2 unrelated pieces of information. One was from George Dyson, who is going to be here tomorrow if he's not here already.
He will be.
Which was a book that he wrote about Leibniz and about the first sort of efforts toward computing, Darwin among the machines. It was basically that Leibniz worked on computers. And then unrelated to that, another friend of mine mentioned that he had been studying Newton and the fact that Newton ran the mint. So here I was, almost finished writing a book about computers and money, and I found out that 300 years ago, the two smartest people that we know about in the world at that time, one was working on computers, the other was working on money, and they hated each other. And then I started looking into that era, which is a little bit of a blank page when we learn American history. We don't learn a lot about that span of years. And Pilgrims, Salem witch trials, that's about it. And it turned out to be a really interesting period of history with lots of pirates and sword fights and other things that make for good novel writing. So I thought, well, how can I not do this? So I dove into that, and it wasn't as I was saying to Tom earlier, this isn't me being motivated by some grand plan to achieve a specific thing. It really grows out of telling a fun yarn about interesting characters, and writing some plot. I thought this was a good place to do that. So I don't really know if I had a clearly articulated goal out of that. It's not how I operate in general, but I guess I wanted to show that that these themes that are important to us today, money and computers, are old themes, and that it was possible to tell a fun story about them. Thanks.
Hi. So I have a question related to your work at Magic Leap. I'm wondering how you see your role as an entertainer in the medium of AR. How do you see entertainment happening in augmented reality?
So I'm the chief futurist, which is a fairly ambiguous title. And what I said at the very beginning was that I didn't want to just be a navel-gazing kind of chief futurist, but I wanted to look for some way to actually do something. And for various reasons, it seems like making experiences is a good way to do that. So I'm thinking about ways to make experiences that one can have using this kind of hardware. And it turns out to be quite an interesting problem on a bunch of levels, because you need to use basically technology. The tool chain that is used by the game industry is the tool chain that you need. Game engines and Maya and Photoshop and all of that stuff is what you need to use, but you need to use it in a radically different way. And so none of the standard operating procedures of the game industry are directly transferable, because the interface is different, and you don't control the world. You can add things to the real world, but you don't get to decide where the chair is. The chair is where it is, and you have to deal with that. And that's hard. It's a really interesting challenge. So I guess my big picture answer to your question is that when new platforms come along, usually after a certain period of time, people figure out how to make money by generating content for those platforms. So in the case of movies, turns out the way to make money is to make sequels to existing superhero franchises, right? And so all of the money goes to that. And it becomes difficult to make things that are not that, because that's how you make money. And the same is true of games, or for that matter, even books or other kinds of media. And so, but when a new platform comes along, there's this window of time during which nobody knows yet how to make money from it. And during that window of time, you may have an opportunity to try a bunch of weird new stuff. So that's where we're at right now.
Perhaps when we have robot socialism and nobody has to make money, you can be truly creative. And music it would be completely the panacea for, because great music comes associated with money, in my opinion, right? So if that broadens, we'll see this new art form blossom.
It's tough because the tool chain is hard to use, right? Even in a normal game production environment, it requires a lot of sophistication to use it. And as I said, we're now having to use it in different ways. So,
when you embed with a company, what level do you engage with the company? I mean, do you work with the engineers? Do you develop code with them? Do you work at an application level? Are you just with the board meeting on vision, or is it all across the board?
I'm more the hang out with engineers kind of person, but the caveat is that, so I'll take Blue Origin as an example. It's not enough in engineering just to know how to use the tools of engineering. So you can be super good, for example, at writing code or at using a CAD program, and that's great, but actually participating in a large engineering effort has a huge sort of social and organizational and cultural component. You've got to check in your code in a civilized way. You've got to, you've got to get along with the other people working on the project and a million other things which are not my strong suit. I mean, I didn't ever have to learn that stuff. So in the case of Blue Origin, for example, when it turned its efforts towards a more serious and focused engineering process, that was the point where I was kind of like, well, I can't be a responsible engineer if I'm going to disappear for 3 weeks at random intervals and go on book tours, and so the area where I can actually be of any use has got a lot of the nitty-gritty engineering kind of stuff to it, but it's before we've gotten into the realm of a serious, planned, budgeted, scoped engineering process.
So the visionary part, it's still dealing with the real technology and the real technical issues, but before it actually gets down to line items in a workflow.
Yeah, I mean, I think the visionary part is kind of the easy part in some ways, and the important part is having enough of a foothold on the engineering realities to know what is an achievable vision in a reasonable period of time.
If you had to pick another domain outside of Blue Origin or Magic Leap where you'd enjoy that early stage exploratory culture and really want to be shaping the nitty-gritty with some of the engineers, is it something like a CRISPR biolab, a genetic engineering lab? Is it something like MIT DCI where you have computers and money?
Yeah.
What
maybe
appeals to
JPL
you?
looking for the origin or looking for life elsewhere.
Yeah, I feel like I'm so weak in the life sciences that I wish I'd learned more about that stuff, but I didn't. I'm more of a code and physics kind of brain. So it would be quite a challenge to try to turn myself into somebody that different. I guess, I don't know, I like building things. I enjoy writing code, but again, once the project grows beyond a certain level of seriousness and responsibility, I have to sort of back away.
We're very playful here. I think we could adopt you as the Space Initiative space architect.
Sort of wacky mascot.
Daza had a question. If the microphone can get to him, who has the holy microphone? Holy hand grenade
does
microphone.
The person who, oh well.
Okay. Big fan.
Yeah, talk loud and right up
So,
there.
Snow Crash was required reading in my MIT courses in the 90s, by the way, for 3 years. My area here is law and technology, and been looking at Accelerando now much more closely, the parts where you talk about this, basically smart contracts and virtual legal entities that can be spun up quickly, like servers in a Docker or some kind of DevOps environment. I'm wondering, I like the way you talk about law and technology and creatively extrapolate how it could be used as part of complex workflows. What are you thinking now in terms of what could be the role of law, lawyers, justice, as we build out these environments, and especially as we look at things like the question you posed, the big challenge about distinguishing what's true, what's not true, and the role of human judgment?
Well, actually, just 2 days ago, I was having lunch with a friend of mine. He was one of the aforementioned cypherpunks who now is a lawyer in New York, practicing crypto law. And so yeah, I don't know, I've been reading a book whose name I'm going to forget because I can never remember these things, but it's A Culture of Fact. Barbara Shapiro. Sorry, I just have a little latency in the name buffer.
You need the wearable.
Yeah. And it's about, I'm reading it because it's about fact, the idea of facts and where that idea came from, because we didn't always just have that idea. And so she tells the story about how she traces it back to the judicial system in England, where you had these traveling judges who would go to communities to address crimes that had taken place maybe weeks or months earlier. And so you can't just walk into the crime scene and like finger somebody and, you know, it's not that kind of scene at all. There's no evidence. You've got to have an algorithm. You've got to impanel a jury. You've got to then find witnesses, and you've got to impose certain rules, like this is where we get no hearsay evidence, and a bunch of all of the machinery that we have now sort of emerges from that tradition, and it's it's a very carefully thought out algorithm that they use to establish facts that were remote from their own perception. In other words, this happened 3 months ago. I'm a judge. My job is to find out what happened. I can't just throw up my hands and say, I don't know. I have to produce an answer. Here's my algorithm. And so she goes on to talk about how the elements of this thinking and this process then got picked up by other professions. So starting with history, people who wrote history prior to this tended to be quite poetic. And, like Herodotus will jump from pretty straight up history to ridiculous myth, like in the middle of a sentence. And that was considered normal then, because that's part of what historians did. And that starts to go away as the historians begin to say, no, this is not what we do. We have to be like judges. We have to look at the evidence. So they're using judicial terminology and judicial style procedures in order to write better history. And then she goes on to talk about how similar things happen with the early Royal Society and their procedure for examining evidence and deciding what is scientific fact, and people who wrote travel logs. So it's a highly recommended read, about how law and legal procedures and legal thinking became really pervasive and really important outside of just law and in science and history writing, and that all then flows through. If we have histories that people agree on as being legitimate historical, accounts of what happened, then We can base intelligent decisions upon those histories. So it's not an answer yet, but it's sort of at least a slightly less depressing kind of. It suggests that we were once in a state where we didn't have a way of deciding on facts, and we sort of managed to climb our way out of that. And so, A Culture of Fact by Barbara Shapiro. Great book.
This is so critical in the judicial context, and interestingly, that makes me think of a New York Times article that I think is #1 most popular on New York Times Online right now by Fahad, one of their contributing editors, around the beauty of returning for a few months just to print newspapers and facts that are determined slowly, deliberately, well-researched in a similar context in which a judge might do it, and the beauty of getting off of the instant notification news cycle.
Yeah. So...
Yeah, so it's been like a couple of years now since Project Hieroglyph.
Can't see the cube. You got okay.
Is this good?
Yeah.
All right. A couple of years since Project Hieroglyph, and the role of optimism in science fiction in helping society tackle big problems.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, given a 5-year retrospective, what kind of an impact you felt that project had.
Well, I don't know. I think so he's referring to a project that we ran with Arizona State to produce an anthology of optimistic science fiction. And so a number of science fiction writers contributed stories to this collection. And particularly of interest here is Cory Doctorow's story, which is about 3D printers on the moon. So, that is totally worth checking out if you space geeks haven't seen that one yet. I think it was. There were some good stories in it. I think it was an opportunity to kind of go around and raise that issue and talk about it a little bit. It's hard to trace results from it. You never know. You never know what the results of these things are. But I feel like there was a little uptick in people being more conscious of, why are they always dystopias? Can we please get away from the dystopia thing for a minute?
The effects on young people too. I see my daughters in middle school. They're reading science fiction, all dystopia.
Yeah.
It's easier to write a story. There's obviously something there that's a conflict. There's a drive, but you wonder about the effects. We were talking about E. Doc Smith earlier, right? That was kind of a crazy space utopia, being a space opera.
Yes.
And that was when it started. It wasn't
that
dystopic.
tradition.
Although Wells may have been dystopic in many ways. Of course, Time Machine, War of the Worlds.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I work in human factors, human-machine interaction, and situations where the machine works beautifully, the human is sane, and when you put them together, things go terribly wrong. You do that narrative and talk about that very compellingly, more compellingly than most people I've ever read. It's one of my favorite things about your writing. So a lot of us actually work in that area, and we live in a world where that type of drama is more and more important and more common. Can you give us some advice on how to talk about that narrative and how to help the world understand how important it is? As a scientist...
Which narrative?
The narrative of you have a human and a machine, and the interaction between them is something important and that should be looked at closely. This can be called human factors, human-machine interaction. I work in human-machine trust. But these themes run deeply through your writing, and you're very good at making them compelling and interesting. As a scientist, I work to make both my grant committees and the people who I disseminate my findings to understand that. And I know many of us do. Many of us work in that space.
Well, I got it easy compared to you. I can just write that they have this user interface, that does this, that, and the other thing, and it's awesome. It's as you know, and as anyone knows who works in UI design, actually making a UI that works and that works consistently for a lot of different human beings on different hardware and different conditions, is amazingly hard. And even if you think you've got something dialed in and working really well, if the processor gets busy or the memory is full, and it slows down the responsiveness of a widget by a fraction of a second, it just blows everything to hell. So I guess from what little I've seen of actually trying to do this, as opposed to just making stuff up in a hand-wavy fashion in books, it's really, the devil is really in the details of figuring out how these tiny little micro interactions work, and how it is trust. Your word trust really is the key to it, because if one time you try to pull the menu down and it doesn't come down, it destroys your trust and your expectation that the menu is what it purports to be. You get confused, and I see this all the time with people who are not as computery, and when the UI is glitchy or slow or doesn't do what they expect, it all goes to hell.
I've worked with autonomous vehicles, cyber defense, and in your books, a lot of the drama you build is out of these types of interactions, actually.
Well, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I said in your books, the type of drama that you build is often out of things like autonomous vehicles, robots, human-machine interaction.
Well, I think that a way to sell the realism of a fictional world is to get into some of that nitty-gritty stuff a little bit, because it's something we deal with all the time, living in a technological society. So the limitations that we face on technology, the surprising, frequently bad surprises that happen when something goes wrong, or there's some human error involved, or something just breaks. We've all been there. We've all had those experiences, and so in a fictional setting, I think one, trick, for lack of a better word, that I can use as an author is to include moments where the system doesn't work perfectly, or it's slow, or somebody makes a mistake, or something breaks, because, as I said, we've all been there, and it immediately feels like, that rings true. That's what would happen.
Yeah.
Talking about UI, as far as we can look in UI, we do a lot of it here, are implantables. And in Snow Crash, you didn't like them very much, it seems. Right? They were the agents of the evil Sumerians to mind control people. But of course, it's been many years since, and that's looming ever closer. And you talked about the network being based around video games. What would the network based around implantables look like, perhaps? Or is there an upside to it? What do you think about this? Or do you think it will not happen?
Implantables really, to me, gets us into a space that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. So I don't know. I know a few people who've done it on a small level, like implanting chips in their fingers or whatever, for various purposes. I don't know. I see why that's a super important thing to think about here at the MIT Media Lab. I think I don't know. I have to ponder that one a little harder, because anything that modifies your body immediately gets you into a cultural space that is sort of weird, or
uncanny valley or something.
Yeah, and so that's not necessarily a fair judgment. but you're definitely making a cultural statement.
Yeah.
When you get even a small tattoo or a piercing, unless it's a nice, normal ear piercing and you're a girl, then it's fine. But any other piercings, you know, so culturally you've stepped over into a kind of a different space, and you're kind of making a statement.
Except if you're deaf and you have a cochlear implant. I mean, when
Yeah.
it's a prosthetic, it's another story. And as those develop to the point where they can do other things, that's another kind of a slope.
Yeah, well, there is that. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a fascinating topic. I don't know if I can do justice to it.
Two things that come to mind that might interest you on that regard. One is Janen's work, some of the work by one of our new faculty members at the Media Lab, looking at implantables under the skin. There's a new clean room here, basically building a facility to be able to do some of that development in-house. And then Hugh Hare's work with prosthetic limbs and the bionic man and human 2.0, question being, once his limbs, and they're already so close, if not already surpassing this, less energy to use a prosthetic limb to bound than the energy required for a natural human body. When do you choose to self-amputate? Because it'll give you an advantage over just being something that replaces functionality that you once had. So choosing to do these.
Yeah, if it gives you an advantage and what you really want. Yeah. So, okay, so let me back away from what I said a minute ago to that I wasn't thinking of disability type situations. That's a different category of stuff. But voluntarily changing a normal body to enhance it or whatever gets us into a...
In Seven Eves, though, that happened, but I think it happened prenatally, right? So they didn't choose themselves; it was chosen for them.
It was chosen for them by each of the Eves gets a free one, gets to choose one genetic alteration that she thinks will make for a better human future.
So,
Hi.
Go ahead, Margaret.
So speaking of extremes, I wanted to ask the one-way ticket question for all of you up here. Exploring space is really breathtaking, and we feel that. Just wondering, would any of you take a one-way ticket, and to where and under what conditions and why? Kind of an open-ended exploration question.
You stole my final question for Neal, which is going to be, would you go to Mars? And if yes or no, give us the answer as to why. If you want to take that first, and then Joe and I could answer for ourselves.
Sure. The more that I looked at space, the more I was confronted by the reality that it would be, at least for the foreseeable future, a pretty unpleasant place to be. Certainly if you're in zero G, it's terrible. If you're in zero G and exposed to radiation all the time, which is true of almost all people who've ever been in space, that is bad news, and it's and it's going to be that way for a long time. It's going to be like living in a corridor at Port Authority.
Oh boy.
Oh, the best.
That's an image.
You're not going to be drifting, looking at the Crab Nebula, and it's going to be pretty gritty, and you're going to have to be underground a lot because of cosmic rays, and you're going to be confined to a space that might not smell so good, and eventually that'll all get better, and we'll build great big huge floating space colonies. But I don't know if I would take a one-way ticket if I'm going to end up in one of those environments until I die. Right? To me, there's not enough payoff to justify that. Maybe later when we have really pretty places to go that smell nice.
I would go. I would go. So I thought about this for a while, and I'm already calculating the years to when I think NASA will open up recruiting for 2030s, 2040s astronauts. And will I be too old at that point to be able to do a manned Mars mission, say? one-way ticket is a hard choice. I really love the verdant green earth. People who know me know that I have like 30 houseplants in my apartment at the moment. So that would be hard to give up family and give up a life here. But I think that's part of what makes us human, and something really special about us is that we want to explore, we want to go push the final frontier, and I would absolutely go.
I think you both have great points. I mean, I tend to agree with Neal that anything we do to the planet on our own pretty much is not going to make it as bad as any of the places we can get to, right? Venus is just terrible, inconceivable.
Terrible planet.
Yeah, you don't want to hang out there for milliseconds. And Mars, we can live inside of caves and stuff like that. There's radiation, there's no air, there's no air we can breathe.
We have to build it to be our own.
It's cold, blah, 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 blah. So we're living in the tunnel, basically. We go to a place like that. And I think unless you have to, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time in these environments. I think the deeper question, if you look at, eventually people going en masse into space, right? Technology evolves, and I think there could be a time when something leaves. What will it be? Will it be anything we recognize as human? Humans aren't built to live there. And if you look at the scales of modifying ourselves, it's about the same time scale as going into space. And the singularity stuff, if you believe any variant of that, that's all kind of coming at the same time. So what goes into space probably won't be us as we know it. And that leads to my last question for Neal. Where are the aliens? I mean, you'd think that, right, if life is plentiful, they've been doing something we can notice. Even though they leave in their solar system, they do something. Or are they just doing VR and buried in their magic leaps? They don't care.
It seems pretty clear that there aren't any.
Yeah.
I mean,
Cold?
Yeah, but I mean, it just it seems like a really, really, really simple explanation of the observable facts is that there aren't any. Right?
At least any doing things that we think they would do, right? Yeah. If we change ourselves, they could be doing things we can't even conceive of. Or they could have self-destructed, in which case there aren't any. You're back to that. Or they just never were made.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's that one thread of hope that maybe they do something that we don't know. Space is boring. It's just stuff. I mean, I love it. I'm like Ariel. I mean, I was born to go, and I love this stuff, and blah, blah. I applied as an astronaut. I did all these things, and, we have our hopes with you. But, that's now. If you wait, 50, 100 years, the time scale when everybody could go, realistically into space, we won't be the same organisms necessarily if we're still here.
Yeah. It is interesting to think about this paradigm that we have, that anytime we send an organism currently out into space, it has to be surrounded in an Earth-like environmental bubble, right? Air, certain temperature,
we love
water.
your nested plastic bags, by the way.
Yes, like
we talk about that a lot.
Living in the
yeah, not mine,
bags.
totally, but...
Not that I want to hang out in one for a while, but it's a great solution.
Yeah. But how do you flip that? How do you not have to send humans always up into space in an Earth-like environmental bubble? Can you instead make humans, ourselves, or organisms more space tolerant? And for anybody watching the live stream who's going to tune in to Beyond the Cradle tomorrow, which is a big space event being held at the Media Lab, we're going to talk a little bit about some tardigrade research being done here at the lab in cryptobiosis, trying to take a genetic property that would make organisms more vacuum, desiccation tolerant, more radiation tolerant, and create a new wave of organisms, eventually humans, very, very far in the future.
I mean, there's also true enlightenment. So what we've been able to figure out from just being on Earth has been amazing. If we just augment ourselves a little bit, if not progress more, we're going to be able to figure everything out probably by staying here. And then why do anything? I don't know. That's a question for Joey, I guess. Yeah. We bring enlightenment into the...
I mean, I do think that we're confined to the solar system. So barring huge, huge changes in biology, we are never, ever going to get out of the solar system in a significant way. I mean, go a little bit outside the solar system, but we're never going to go to other stars. And so if that's true of other alien species, it would explain quite a bit about why we don't see them, but it doesn't explain everything.
Yeah, we'll find a lot out, I think, in the next decade or two. It's going to be an exciting time as we start getting these observations from robotic spacecraft back about the nature of life and where it is or where it isn't.
Yeah.
So on that note, this has been wonderful, Neal. Great to see you back at the lab. You're welcome anytime. We hope you're not a stranger here.
Yeah. It's good to be here. It's been too long. So
we'll fix that going forward.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.